Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you to all of you who are participating in today's webinar. I hope you find this both informative and helpful, and we're going to jump right in because we do have a lot of information to cover. So to start with, on slide number 2, is what is country of origin labeling? Well, country of origin labeling was bipartisan legislation sponsored by Senator Tim Johnson from South Dakota and Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming in the 2002 Farm Bill, and it's a consumer right-to-know legislation. It requires retailers at the final point of sale to inform consumers as to the country of origins of their muscle cuts of beef, lamb, and pork, ground beef, ground lamb, ground pork, farm-raised fish and wild fish, and perishable agricultural commodities. Those are fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables. And then it also includes peanuts. And we've gone through several iterations. In the 2008 Farm Bill, additional products, goat meat, chicken, ginseng, pecans, and macadamia nuts were added. And then in the most recent 2014 Farm Bill, they added venison to the list of commodities that consumers are to know the origins of. There were several exemptions within the COOL law. One is that if the commodity is an ingredient in a processed food item. So if the product had been cooked, cured, or smoked, for example, it would no longer be required to be labeled. It's also not required to be labeled if it's sold and served through a food service establishment. And also, if it's a small mom and pop type grocery store that's selling the muscle cuts of meat, a grocery store that sells less than $230,000 in invoiced perishable commodities, those retailers are not required to comply with the country of origin labeling law. But the COOL law that was passed in 2002 is by no means new. In fact, it was a Tariff Act of 1930 that required essentially every item imported into the United States to be conspicuously and indelibly marked to indicate to the ultimate purchaser its country of origin. And then there were some exemptions for products that were either difficult or economically prohibitive to mark. And so after the 1930 Tariff Act was passed, in fact, it was in 1937, Congress looked back and the Treasury Department looked back for the previous 5 years and determined which of the products did Customs find too difficult or cost prohibitive to mark as to its country of origin, and did those products arrive and flow into the United States at significant quantities. And so what happened at that point was those products that were not regularly marked during the 5 years prior to 1937 were listed as exemptions under the Treasury Department's so-called J list. It's the list of products that are no longer required to be labeled as a condition of entry into the United States. And so they include such products as livestock, nails, feathers, bolts, and nuts, and raw agriculture commodities like fruits, nuts, and berries. So since 1930, virtually all imported goods have been required to be labeled as to their country of origin, with the exception of some of these products that were difficult, that the customs found difficult to mark. But the product of meat, the ground beef, the ground lamb, ground pork, and muscle cuts of meat, lamb, and pork were already required to be labeled when they arrived in the United States in their immediate containers. The problem, however, was that the U.S. Department of Agriculture considered those imports to be, or imports once they have passed U.S. inspection, to be of domestic origin. So the USDA no longer required the labels that were on the containers for which the product arrived in to be labeled all the way to the ultimate purchaser. In fact, the USDA defined the ultimate purchaser as the person who received the product in the same form that it arrived in across the border. So if a meat packer or a processor were to take the product, repackage it, or even do so little as cut it up, it was no longer required to maintain the integrity of the label to the ultimate consumer. This is also true with how USDA treated livestock. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, once it safety inspected livestock arriving in the United States, it allowed them to be considered as U.S. product. So here we're going to take a look from a horseback view of how we remedy the situation. I want to say here that even though this presentation is from the perspective of the cattle and beef industry, whether you have an interest in consumer issues or manufacturing issues, I hope that this is broad enough that you can apply this to your respective areas of concern. So we would otherwise call this a bird's eye view of country of origin labeling as we go forward. So what did we do to remedy the situation where consumers were no longer receiving the origin information that was required as a condition of entry into the United States? And what we did after several iterations is USDA promulgated a rule on May 24th that went effective May 24th of 2013 that required muscle cuts of meat to be labeled with the name of each country where each of the three production steps of being born, raised, and slaughtered for the animal from which the meat was derived had occurred. So, for example, if an animal had been born in Mexico and then resided in the United States for more than 2 weeks, the label would state product of, or born in Mexico, raised and slaughtered in the United States. But the COOL law reserved for meat that was produced exclusively from animals born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States, the United States label. So an exclusively USA product, that is a product from which the meat was derived, was born, raised, and slaughtered, that would be labeled born, raised, and slaughtered right here in the United States. But this remedy to the problem of consumers not having accurate information did not come fast. In fact, multinational agribusinesses and their trade organizations, like the American Meat Institute, like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, fought hard to stop the implementation of mandatory country of origin labels for USA-born, raised, and slaughtered beef. And they convinced the administration, particularly then Secretary of Agriculture Ann Veneman, to support their efforts to keep consumers in the dark. In fact, the Secretary of Agriculture made it very widely known publicly that she and the administration were opposed to country of origin labeling. And in fact, they said, they talked about the fact that they believed that we had a North American industry and therefore it would be very difficult to distinguish products as to where they were born, raised, and slaughtered. And then we had an 11-year delay in the implementation of country of origin labeling from the time that it was passed in 2002. And what had happened here was the administration began to work on Congress along with the agribusinesses that were opposed to country of origin labeling. And they went through the appropriations process first in 2004 in order to delay the implementation of country of origin labeling for 2 years. Interestingly, however, Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, who did not support country of origin labeling, but who had salmon fishermen that were applying considerable pressure upon Congress, had agreed through the appropriations process to allow the regulations and rules for farm-raised fish and shellfish to go into effect. So in April of 2005, country of origin labeling did go into effect for farm-raised and wild fish and shellfish at the time. But the opponents to country of origin labeling kept pushing. They went back to Congress during the 2006 appropriations process, and they further delayed the implementation of COOL for everything except for fish and wild fish. And then we had what we call the 11th hour deal. And this was after the close of the COOL comment process, when the middle iteration of the regulations were promulgated. That was an interim final rule issued August 1st of 2008. And the comment period, the public comment period, closed on September 30th of that year. After that occurred, in December of 2008, there was a communications back and forth between the U.S. and Canadian ambassadors to the World Trade Organization. And that communication revealed that there was an agreement struck, a quid pro quo, whereby the United States would agree to add flexibility to the country of origin labeling regulations in return for Canada's agreement not to pursue immediately its complaint at the World Trade Organization. So at the 11th hour of the Bush administration, just days before the 2009 inauguration, presidential inauguration, and that was on January 15th, the USDA issued the final COOL rule, the 2009 final COOL rule. And that rule inexplicably allowed packers to commingle a single foreign animal during a production day, and then for that entire day's production to apply a multi-country label. That meant if 99 animals slaughtered that day were exclusively of USA origin, but one animal was brought in from Mexico, for example, then that entire day's production would be mislabeled as a product of the USA and Mexico. This is what Canada wanted. This is what the administration provided. Despite the fact that they had struck an accord where Canada and Mexico would not pursue their WTO complaints, they did so anyway soon thereafter and argued that the country of origin labeling rule of the United States violated the United States obligations under various World Trade Organization agreements. And in fact, when the World Trade Organization reviewed the country of origin labeling law, they found that we violated the national treatment standard. They found that the country of origin labeling violated what they said was Article 2.1 of the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade agreement. And they said the reason was because the requirements, the record-keeping requirements imposed by country of origin labeling required the supply chain to gather more information than what was actually communicated to the consumers in the label itself. In other words, there was a disproportionate amount of information being collected from domestic producers and importers of livestock than what was actually conveyed to the consumers. And they said that this was an example demonstrated that we were discriminating against the foreign livestock. They also said that this very same degree of record keeping and verification requirements were causing the meat packers and the feedlots to have to segregate the foreign animals in order to comply with the COOL requirements. And then they also said that the country of origin labeling itself contains confusing and inaccurate information. That was because, for example, you could have a label that said product of the United States and Canada, but the meat from that label was actually exclusively produced from a USA animal. So those were some of the major criticisms leveled by the WTO. And they essentially said that the COOL was not being applied in an even-handed manner, and that they found that the discrimination was not the result of a legitimate regulatory distinction. In other words, it is possible for the application of a regulation to have the effect of discrimination. In other words, perhaps the marketplace did not have an equivalent demand for a foreign product as a domestic product, and therefore the foreign product was sold for a lesser price. Well, that would be an example where the country might think they're discriminated against, but the simple or the regulatory distinction was that the information communicated to the consumer is what had caused that otherwise discriminatory practice that they would complain of. And so with those criticisms leveled at us, the USDA embarked upon the process of remedying or addressing those criticisms, and on May 24th is when that final COOL rule, its implementing regulations, was put into effect. Actually, it wasn't fully put into effect until November of 2013 because USDA wanted to give some time for outreach and education on the part of the industry. But it is now in effect, and currently the law requires the production steps of birth, raising, and slaughtered or harvested, they can use the term harvested, to be on all muscle cuts of meat. And this effectively ended that deceptive practice of commingling a foreign animal during a day's production for purposes of applying this multi-country label on products that were exclusively of U.S. origin. So now let's look at the benefits of country of origin labeling, and there are many. We view the benefits to be, from an economic perspective, that COOL supports domestic value-added supply chains and it prevents industry consolidation. From a consumer standpoint, we believe it prevents consumer deception, it provides consumers with more choices, and it empowers consumers to make informed decisions. They could use the information on a COOL label as a proxy for food safety. They could use that information to express their nationalism or patriotism, for example. And we think that country of origin labeling, or we know, it enhances competition because it provides synchronous information. Both buyers and sellers in the marketplace know where the product originated from, and as a result of having equivalent information, informed decisions could be made when they're purchasing products. As well, we believe that country of origin labeling actually facilitates more accurate price discovery. So with these benefits in mind, we're going to head to greener pastures here and talk about why these benefits are of such critical importance to the United States. And I want to back up a little bit here because the Coalition for a Prosperous America sat down a couple of years ago and hammered out what we believe to be, or what they believe to be, the principles that should guide the United States in terms of a national trade policy. We have been concerned that the United States has embarked on a piecemeal basis to negotiate trade agreements, but without ever having established a cohesive trade strategy for the United States. So we sat down with manufacturers and agriculture producers and workers and came up with 13 principles that we think were absolutely critical in order for the United States to meet its trade objectives, and those trade objectives had to be to benefit the United States. So among those 13 principles, we included that trade agreements must strive to optimize domestic value-added chains. And the reasoning behind this is we viewed that the individual parts of these value-added chains did not contribute as much as the entire chain itself. In other words, the sum was greater than each of the individual parts in that supply chain. Also among the 13 principles that we believed denoted a cohesive strategy for the United States was our desire to have all products labeled as to their country of origin labeling, and we believe that this helped to expand and promote our domestic value-added supply chain. So let's look at this. And if you're a manufacturer or a worker, you may want to apply this to your particular situation. But slide number 17 shows the value-added supply chain for the cattle industry. At the top of the chart, we see the cow-calf sector, which then moves to the stocker or yearling sector, and then to the feedlot sector. That represents the supply chain leading to the meat packers and processors, the agribusinesses in our industry, that ultimately leads to the consumer. Now, at the bottom of this chart, you see the time at which each of these supply chain components are actually engaged in our economy. For the cow-calf sector, you've got 5 to 11 months. For the stocker and yearling sector, 12 to 20 months. And for the feedlot sector, 3 to 5 months. So you've got somewhere between 18 to 30 months where the supply chains for the cattle industry are making contributions to the rural economy and the economy of the United States. And country of origin labeling promotes this because if consumers at the far right of this chart consistently choose and prefer a United States product, then the meat packer that is relying upon the supply chain can go only to one source to obtain the supplies to meet the consumer demand for USA beef. That meat packer has to go and procure those supplies from producers right here in the United States of America. That is how COOL supports the supply chain. But COOL also helps to prevent industry consolidation. And here's why. It's because mergers and acquisitions are able to run rampant when firms within the industry are distressed. They are then acquired by those who are not distressed. And in our cattle industry, we see that the agribusiness sector, the U.S. beef packers, are able to source their current supplies from a variety of areas. They can obtain boxed beef and carcasses from among the 16 countries that we import beef from. They can obtain live cattle that's imported directly from either Canada or Mexico that goes directly to slaughter. And there's cattle that are imported, live cattle from Canada and Mexico that are then fed in the United States and then are routed through U.S. feedlots before going to the meat packers. But if the meat packers were to avoid the domestic cattle operations and instead choose to acquire their supplies from imported products and imported cattle, they can cause the domestic cattle industry to be distressed with lower prices. And upon the cattle industry becoming distressed, they can begin the process or augment the process of fully vertically integrating the U.S. cattle industry like they have already done with the U.S. poultry industries and the U.S. hog industries. But let's look now to what is the value of maintaining domestic supply chains here in the United States? I'm going to give you, of course, a cattle example. This chart shows, a chart on page 19, shows the cost of producing a calf on a per cow basis. So this is the cost to the rancher of raising a single calf from it changes from 1996 to 2013. So in 96, it cost about $850 per cow to raise one calf. 2013, we're about $1,350 per cow to raise one calf. Now, what's not shown here is the same type of costs associated with feeding that calf onto the weight where it would then be harvested for human consumption. That cost in 2013 was about $1,650. So the total cost of bringing the calf to the marketplace is about $3,000. That $3,000 represents an invoice of expenses paid to America's economy. It represents taxes, interest, and insurance paid. It represents electricity paid, equipment purchases, supply purchases, and very importantly, it represents labor. So for each cow, we are essentially contributing $3,000 to the domestic economy. And overall, with our current herd size, albeit the smallest herd we've had in about 60 years, we're still contributing about $58 billion to the United States economy, and that's significant. But the World Trade Organization and the multinational agribusinesses have a completely different view and vision of the world. They are actively promoting not domestic supply chains, but rather made in the world supply chains. In fact, they have their own campaign, their own logo. You can see it here. There's an example of an airplane where many of its parts were produced in different areas of the world. And so let's look at the involvement of the WTO in trying to interfere with our efforts to maximize domestic supply chains in order to provide jobs and economic opportunity right here in America. The WTO views this effort of made in the world as a re-engineering of global governance. We are, in fact, talking about global governance on the part of the WTO. And so what the WTO has explained is that most supply chains are now scattered across the globe, and products are no longer made in the United States, made in the UK. They are now most likely made in the world, according to former Director General Pascal Lamy. But here's what's also important, is that the WTO is trying to influence, if not coerce and encourage, all other nations to do this. And that is they want the United States and others to agree to import a part of the supply chain from emerging countries, with the thought that this would promote development of a new middle class, and these countries will turn around then and become purchasers of the United States. Now, you've probably heard this mantra before, but here's what we're really talking about. Country of origin labeling right now focuses on Canada and Mexico as suppliers in competition with domestic cattle producers. But Canada and Mexico have relatively small herd sizes. Canada's at 14 million, Mexico's at 25 million. What the agribusinesses really want is down the road. They want to access the huge cattle herds in emerging and developing countries in order to maximize their profits, which will, in fact, be detrimental to the interests of the United States and United States cattle producers. For example, they would like to access India's cattle herd of 324 million, Brazil's at 198 million, China's at 104 million. These are the countries where the meat packers and the agribusiness firms would like to begin sourcing their livestock in order to lower the price and to make them more competitive on the global market. So that's why, from an economic perspective, we firmly believe cool is absolutely imperative if we wish to maximize the supply chains that are currently contributing to the economic well-being of rural American communities and the United States as a whole. But there's other benefits, as we talked about. We believe cool prevents industry consolidation. And here's a statement from Patty Lavera of Food and Water Watch, and this was a statement issued in her declaration in the litigation that we're involved in defending cool. She said that prior to cool, meatpackers were able to pay less for imported than local cattle, but have been able to commingle the product and prey on consumer confusion regarding labels to sell meat from imported animals at higher prices than they would otherwise warrant. She says the 2013 rules will likely dampen this effect as consumers will know what countries the product is actually from, notwithstanding that it bears a USDA inspection and grade label. See, many people did not realize, and I said this at the beginning, that when an importer product enters the United States in a container labeled with its country of origin labeling, the USDA, once it passes inspection, views it to be domestic. Well, USDA puts a sticker on it that says inspected by US inspected or USDA inspected. That inspection sticker, along with the USDA grade label that is eligible to be applied to foreign animals, or the meat from foreign animals, those two labels have deceived consumers into believing when they see that label on the product, it must denote the product's domestic origin, and nothing could be further from the truth. As we'll point out later here, talk about the 16 countries that we currently import from. Now, I also said that COOL enhances competition because it provides synchronous information. It provides the buyer with the same amount of information as the seller has. In this instance, the buyer is the ultimate consumer, and the seller is the meat packer and the retailer. And we had the Senator John Thune, back when he was a congressman, stated during the discussions of the Farm Bill, he specifically said that the Farm Bill will enhance producer competition by requiring mandatory country of origin labeling for agricultural competition. Obviously, competition can only work if consumers can distinguish the products at the grocery store level where they purchase it. If consumers cannot distinguish the product, then they cannot send demand signals back along the supply chain. In fact, if consumers can't signal that demand signal by their buying preferences, then they essentially relegate that authority to the meat packers that can unilaterally decide from what country they want to procure their meat to sell to the unsuspecting consumers. COOL enhances competition because it empowers consumers to exercise choice at the marketplace, and it is that exercise of choice that sends the competitive signals all throughout the meat supply chain. The other thing that country of origin labeling does is it actually facilitates more accurate price discovery. A study was done back in 2003 by Colorado State University, and what they found was that purchasers, consumers in Denver and Chicago were willing to pay premiums for steak and hamburger that were labeled as to their origin. And in an actual auction type study scenario, they found that consumers would pay on average 19% more for steak labeled guaranteed USA, born and raised in the United States. And so we think that pro-competition aspect of country of origin labeling also is vital to the United States. We also, as I said before, COOL provides more consumer choices. And this is somewhat interesting. The meat packers and their allies claimed in their lawsuit against COOL that beef is beef, whether the cattle was born in Montana, Manitoba, or Mazatlan. And we believe, however, that consumers deserve to know just where the beef they're purchasing originated from. And so here on slide 26 is a list of the 16 countries that the United States has procured imported beef from. And I'm sure many of you may not be aware that we are importing beef from Chile, Croatia, and Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, for example. Consumers deserve to know that. Consumers can, by virtue of having this information, decide for themselves whether they have confidence in the veterinary infrastructure and the food safety infrastructure in those countries. It provides another level or layer of safety considerations that they can apply in their purchasing decisions. And the other issue that we believe COOL is supportive of, and that is the empowerment of consumers to use that information for a variety of purposes. In fact, USDA recognizes, even though the opponents say that COOL is not a food safety issue, that it is a marketing issue, that is absolutely true, but that marketing information can be used by consumers for a variety of purposes. And here's what USDA found that marketing information was useful for. They said that surveys indicate that consumers may desire COOL not out of any intrinsic value they place knowing the country of origin, but because it represents to them a proxy for product safety or quality, serves as an indicator of desirable environmental or labor practices, or represents a means for them to support U.S. or another country's producers. And that's very true. That's some of the value that country of origin labeling provides specifically to consumers. So now with all of these benefits, things appear to be quite calm for country of origin labeling, but unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. The multinational meatpackers and their allies have literally come unglued and are aggressively working to dismantle and weaken country of origin labeling. They have opened every imaginable front in order to defeat COOL. They've done so in the U.S. federal court system. They're fighting in U.S. Congress. They're issuing public industry propaganda, and they're fighting country of origin labeling at the World Trade Organization. Now, this should give you some idea of how significant this issue is to independent businesses, to consumers in the United States. Here we're looking at a list of those entities that have filed a federal court action against country of origin labeling. They are the nation's most powerful politically and economically agribusinesses, including the American Meat Institute that represents the major packers, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and the list. We've got the Canadian Cattlemen's Association and the Canadian Pork Council, all of which are trying to overturn country of origin labeling. And here's their arguments. They say that the requirement in the most recent regulations that requires them to inform you, the consumer, where the product had been born, where raised, and where slaughtered, violates their constitutional protected right to freedom of speech. They don't want to be compelled to provide you with that accurate information. Secondly, they said that the new COOL regulation prohibits their practice of commingling. Again, commingling allowed the meatpackers to place a multiple country label, such as product of Canada, U.S., and Mexico, on a product even if it was exclusively produced in the United States. Third, they said that the born, raised, and slaughtered labels are simply not authorized under the 2002 statute, and they claim that there's no substantial government interest in country of origin labeling in the rule itself. So far, the District Court of the District of Columbia has denied a preliminary injunction request. That request was then appealed. The appellate court had affirmed the lower court's decision, but the appellate court on its own motion had called for an en banc hearing to determine or to address a very narrow issue. The narrow issue is whether under the First Amendment, judicial review of mandatory disclosure, again, the born, raised, and slaughtered requirements, which is purely factual and uncontroversial commercial information, whether that compelling of that information should be reviewed under either the Zanderar precedent or Central Hudson precedent. So a very narrow issue is being discussed. We firmly believe that regardless of the outcome of this en banc hearing, that country of origin labeling will nevertheless prevail because we think it meets the criteria of both of these cases. And we are currently awaiting the en banc decision. But country of origin labeling is also being attacked in Congress. The agribusinesses have tried to defeat country of origin labeling in each of the past 3 farm bills. But interestingly, as we talked about in the very first slide, in each of the last 3 farm bills where the agribusinesses have been fighting vehemently to defeat country of origin labeling, Congress has actually been adding commodities to country of origin labeling. And that's why we presently have such commodities as venison most recently added. But during the process of the farm bill, there was rumors coming from very reliable sources indicating that the agribusinesses wanted USDA to forego the USA label and instead begin affixing a North American label, which we believe would certainly confuse U.S. consumers and would provide them with absolutely inaccurate information. Fortunately, the Farm Bill conferees ignored and were able to overcome the tremendous lobbying pressure of the meatpackers, and no language was included to weaken country of origin labeling. But the attack now is within the appropriations process, and we currently have language in the House Appropriations Committee report language that essentially directs the committee or directs the Secretary of Agriculture to suspend until further notice the country of origin labeling rule that went into effect in May of 2013 if the WTO's final ruling goes against the United States. And then we have the meatpackers on yet another front issuing propaganda, though it's not included in the letter they recently sent. These groups are trying to argue that the United States exports will suffer about a $2 billion impact if the WTO rules against us, because they say Canada and Mexico will issue retaliatory tariffs on a variety of U.S. products. In fact, Canada actually provided a list of the products that it intended to apply tariffs to. And so this was a tremendous lobbying effort, we believe a very deceptive one, but nevertheless, there was a letter submitted to Congress that essentially said from 62 agribusiness groups that it would be intolerable for the United States essentially to not acquiesce to a WTO decision if the WTO were to rule against our country of origin labeling law. And here's a list of the groups, the 62 organizations that you can see are some of the most powerful economic and political entities in the United States that are marching the halls of Congress in efforts to defeat country of origin labeling. So the World Trade Organization has essentially attacked our sovereignty, attacked our United States constitutional right to pass laws to self-governance, and they've said that we are not allowed to maintain country of origin labeling. And after the May 2013 Cool Rule was put into effect, Canada and Mexico filed for a compliance review that is currently ongoing at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. In fact, the interim compliance report has already been issued to the parties themselves, and the public may actually see that report in the latter part of July. But we have to ask the question, why is our sovereignty under attack by the WTO? Why is our ability to pass laws under the U.S. Constitution now being subjected to second guessing by this international tribunal? And what we have is a unique situation in our industry. We have a situation where the Department of Justice and the USDA have failed miserably to enforce our U.S. antitrust laws and our laws that ensured fairness of competition, particularly against the multinational meatpackers. And as a result, we went through a merger mania within our industry, and we now have 4 meatpackers that control 85% of the marketplace. It's an oligopoly. And they possess tremendous market power sufficient to enable them to discriminate, to choose not to purchase products from different countries. And we see, if we go back to what it was that the WTO criticized the U.S. for, it was for 3 things. 1, the information collected by the supply chain was disproportionate to the information actually communicated to consumers. Second, the commingling allowance caused confusion to consumers. But thirdly, they said that the information requirements not only was disproportionate, but the requirements themselves created a situation where the packers and the retailers were forced to segregate the foreign livestock at a higher cost. And that resulted in price discounts. And the 2013 Cool Rule really only addressed the first 2. It did not address the meatpackers in Canada and Mexico's complaint that their livestock was being subject to financial discounts by the meatpackers. And in fact, that's exactly what was happening. In the WTO's previous ruling, they acknowledged that foreign livestock were being discriminated between $40 and $60 a head. And they certainly were. And 3 of the nation's largest meatpackers are on that list of 62 organizations that are colluding to fight Cool. Along with them is the North American Meat Association, their trade association. So to the extent that they can collude to defeat a very popular public policy, these packers can also collude by virtue of their synchronous actions in order to discriminate against producers. They can choose to put a $40 discount on a Mexican animal, for example, even if the meat from that animal is later labeled as if it were a product of the United States and Canada and Mexico, undifferentiated in the minds of producers. In other words, the meatpackers possess, in our industry, they possess the market power to unilaterally discriminate against livestock from Canada and Mexico. And by virtue of their discriminatory actions, they can create the appearance and impression that it is the marketplace itself that is creating these discounts and not their unilateral action. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of the meatpackers. They have taken steps in order to provide a rational and plausible reason for the WTO to rule against us, and we're concerned that the WTO remains absolutely oblivious to this tremendous market concentration issue that our industry has been facing for many, many years, and have yet been unsuccessful in reversing this, either through the U.S. Department of Justice's Antitrust Enforcement Division or the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Grain Inspection, Packers, and Stockyards Administration. So we're nearing the end. And from our perspective, COOL is the most pro-producer, pro-consumer, and pro-competition legislation to be passed by Congress in a very, very long time. And we believe that we must preserve it. And so today I asked all of you to begin to call and write each of your congressional members to tell them consumers deserve to know where their food is produced, and they deserve COOL. And importantly, you need to keep delivering that message, because the multi-pronged front of the meatpackers will not go away. They will continue to fight this issue because it is in their economic interest to procure meat from cheaper sources and pass it on to unsuspecting consumers with the reputation of the United States cattle and meat industries. And with that, I thank you for your listening and your indulgence, and we will open this up to questions.
So thank you, Bill. That was a great presentation. Some of you have already written down a question or two. You might notice on your control panel there is a box for questions, and if you have a question for Bill, please type it out and we'll present it and get it answered. Thank you so much. So, Joe?
Yes, Sarah, I hope you can hear me. And once again, excellent presentation, Bill. I really appreciated that. Even though I've been in the livestock business virtually all my life, I always learn more when speaking with you. So I have not got the full list of questions here, but I do have one in front of me that I'd like to discuss, to let Bill take a shot at. This says, given the dwindling U.S. cattle herd and the recent closure of the Cargill, Plainview, and National Beef Brawley Plains plants, what is your response to the Packers' claims that COOL will result in a shutdown of the U.S. plants and layoff of U.S. packing houses? Bill, I hope you heard that.
I certainly did. Yes, the caller mentioned our shrinking cattle herd, and as the caller has probably heard, we've been told that the reason for our shrinking cattle herd is because of the continuing droughts that we've experienced. The fact of the matter is that our cattle herd started to shrink back in the mid-'80s. That was the last time we had a normal cattle cycle. In fact, it was the first time that we saw an 8-year liquidation phase of the U.S. cattle industry was back in the early to mid-'80s, unprecedented in our industry. Suggested to us that there were forces other than the forces of supply and demand that were affecting the profitability of our industry. Then in 1996, we started this unprecedented 18-year liquidation phase of our industry. We started this liquidation phase long before the droughts occurred. What had happened here is during the 80s, we allowed merger mania to continue. The meatpackers acquired tremendous market power. They began to apply that market power on the industry to try to vertically integrate the cattle industry like they already integrated the poultry and hog industries. As a result, they cut the profitability of the industry and forced producers to exit the industry at an alarming rate. We've lost over 500,000 cattle producers just since 1980. When the cattle producers left, so too did the cattle herd. The meatpackers overestimated the extent of their damage and decimation to the cattle industry. They shrunk the industry far further than they ever expected, and yet, while with these tighter supplies, we're now seeing record high cattle prices and consumers are paying record high beef prices. It makes no sense whatsoever for the meatpackers to claim that they cannot provide a lower cost product in our market and not have some consumers seeking that product out. For example, you would think that the Mexican labeled product would be valued by the Hispanic populations. You would think that from the northern tier that many consumers would view Canadian meat products to be quite equivalent to that of the United States, and if there was a price discount, they may choose that. The packers have not offered any economically justified basis for their claim that as a result of cool, they're going to be put out of business. They have put themselves out of business by attempting to destroy our cattle industry, and as a result of disease problems worldwide, they're unable to access the supplies from these other countries in order to make up the difference.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Bill. I think, as Bill's answer indicated, consolidation in this market, as well as virtually every other manufacturing or processing market, has been ongoing for decades, and so it's not surprising that that would be happening recently as well. Here's another question. What was the law relative to 1930 Act that allowed meat to be labeled U.S. merely due to one processing step? In other words, I think what the questioner is getting at, Bill, is what happened after the 1930 Act that originally required country of origin labeling for virtually all products, that allowed U.S. beef to simply avoid that by a processing step?
Yes, excellent question. And the question involves the rules of origin under the WTO agreements. According to the rule of origin, the origin of a product in the global marketplace is the country where the product was last substantially transformed. And so for purposes of trade, if, for example, Canada were to import a cow from Colombia and then slaughter that animal in Canada and then export the resulting beef to the United States, the country of origin of that product, according to the rules of origin at the WTO, would be product of Canada, because Canada substantially transformed the live animal into the commodity beef and then shipped it to the United States. So it's that rule of origin that essentially conflicts with the United States country of origin labeling law that does not use that standard of where the product was last substantially transformed.
All right, I think it's useful for our listeners to be aware of that nuance. Thank you very much, Bill. Here's a question from Dave Frenchel that I think your presentation alluded to the fact that the current beef herd in the U.S. is historically low, and the question from Dave is, how much smaller is the U.S. dairy herd now than it has recently been?
Dave has just asked me a question I cannot answer without looking at the data. I believe we have approximately 9 million dairy cows in the United States. I have not tracked the decline in dairy cows, but I have tracked the decline in dairies. Since 1980, 8 out of every 10 dairy farms has gone out of business today. And that's a direct result of the ongoing consolidation of our industry and the vertical integration of our industry. But unfortunately, Dave, I can't answer your question without going back and seeking data. So if you email me, I would be happy to send you that.
I think, but we do know that it is at historic lows. I think you mentioned the lowest in 60 years. Is that correct?
That's correct for the beef cow herd, but I don't know specifically about the dairy cow herd.
Okay, here's one other question that sort of gets to the heart of CPA, since we are a broad-based organization. And the question is, did the 2002 COOL legislation actually deal with manufactured goods in any way?
And the answer is no, it did not. The 2002 COOL legislation or statute specifically addresses the requirement that retailers must label at the final point of sale the country of origin of the specific food product. So it did not include any manufacturing steps, though it did exempt commodities that had undergone some additional manufacturing. For example, one of the first slides that I showed that the exemptions for smoking, curing, and cooking. So if there was a manufacturing process that was adding teriyaki sauce to a muscle cut of meat, that would have the effect of excluding the product from the country of origin labeling requirements.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Now, that is all of the questions that I am able to see before me on the write-in screen. So if any of others of you have any other questions you'd like to submit, please do so. This would be a very good time to do that. And in the interim, I would like to kind of circle back and express our appreciation to Bill and certainly to Sarah for doing the organization of this this webinar. Obviously, there are a lot of nuts and bolts that have to be put together for a webinar to occur this well. I'd like to thank the Coalition for Prosperous America, its board membership, and I would like to urge each and every one of you who are taking this information today about country of origin labeling to go to the CPA website. That's prosperousamerica.org, and consider becoming a member. We value everyone, every business, every company, every organization that chooses to become a member, and membership is something that we value very highly. We have a very broad-based membership now, and we hope to continue to keep that growing. So once again, that is all that I have for questions at this time, unless
I see
you probably...
I see a couple.
Sarah,
I'm not sure why you're not, but that's fine. I can see them from over here. One that I'd like to address, someone asked if a copy of Bill's slides will be available upon request, and the answer is yes. We will be distributing a recording of this, and we will also be posting Bill's slide to our trade reform blog and probably to our site. I think we have time for at least one more question, just given the time. Bill, this is from Bert and Kathy Smith. It's, can you explain the backdoor importing of beef from South America via Canada?
That's a question that we would like more answers to. We have been concerned that because of the policies of Canada, for example, that says that if an animal is imported into Canada and remains in Canada for 60 days, it's deemed to be a Canadian animal. That means that the origins of live animals that may be imported from other countries would be largely unknown. And we have heard rumors of, and I'm not going to make any allegations because these are strictly rumors, but we've heard rumors that cattle from South America have been shipped to other countries, and that those cattle may then make their way into the United States. We have no confirmation for that. It is an ongoing concern, and I wish I could say more, but I can't because I just don't. We don't know anymore. We just know it's a concern. We've tried to look into it, and we've not been successful in getting any clear evidence that this is going on.
Well, I think that's it, unfortunately, for time. If you have any additional questions, please send them to me at info@prosperousamerica.org. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our co-sponsors and, of course, Bill Bullard and Joe Logan for moderating. Thank you all. And again, please feel free to get in touch with me with any additional questions about the webinar or about CPA.